Welcome, everyone. My name is Laura Podolsky. I am the Assistant Director for the UC Institute of Transportation Studies, commonly referred to as UC-ITS. And I'm so thrilled you joined us for today's webinar, Reducing Vehicle Miles Traveled in California Through Enhanced Land Use and Transportation Strategies. Here, just a moment. I'm trying to advance my slides. There we go. So very quickly, UC Institute of Transportation Studies, we are a network of faculty, staff researchers, administrative staff, and students, all committed to advancing the state of the art in transportation engineering, planning, and policy for the people of California and the world. The UC-ITS has 4 branches in the UC system located at UC Berkeley, UC Davis, UC Irvine, and UCLA. Today's webinar is the 4th in a series that we're doing to highlight a new report driving California's transportation emissions to zero. This report was requested by the state legislature as a part of the 2019 Budget Act. The legislature asked us to identify demand-side strategies to significantly reduce vehicle emissions and achieve carbon neutrality in the transportation sector by 2045. Previous webinars in this series were held in June and July. Our first one provided a great primer on the overarching policy scenario to achieve carbon neutrality. This overarching policy scenario included strategies relevant to light-duty, medium-duty, and heavy-duty vehicles, as well as vehicle miles traveled and fuels. So all the webinars flowing from this first one are looking at these areas in a little bit more detail. So July 1st, we looked more at fuels. July 7th, more on light duty vehicles or cars. Today, we're gonna be exploring vehicle miles traveled. And I hope you join us tomorrow, or next week, sorry, not tomorrow, next week, as we have a webinar looking specifically at medium and heavy duty vehicles. And we are in the planning process to do a webinar looking at the workforce implications. So stay tuned for that. Before we begin, just quickly, some housekeeping notes. If you run into technical issues, please let us know in the chat box and we'll try our best to help you. If you have a question for our speakers or guest respondents, which I hope you do, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Another screen will pop up. You can enter your question in there. Our speakers and guest respondents will be monitoring that the Q&A box, and they'll be typing answers live. So make sure you're monitoring that to see if your question has been addressed. We will also take some questions live at the very end. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the webinar event page as well as in an email that we'll send out to everyone. So now I get to introduce our speakers and guest respondents today. First, we have Tim Lippman. He is a co-director of the Transportation Sustainability Research Center, housed at ITS Berkeley. He's also a research affiliate with the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. His research interests are on electric vehicles, fuel cell technology, combined heat and power systems, renewable energy, and electricity and hydrogen production and distribution infrastructure. He will be presenting alongside Michael Hyland, who is an assistant professor at UC Irvine in Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. He is also an affiliate of the ITS Irvine branch. His research focuses on modeling and analysis techniques to support the planning, design, management, and operations of multimodal transportation systems. After we hear from Tim and Mike, I am pleased to share that we have 2 stellar guest respondents today who are gonna help us ground the research findings into policy and practice for California. So first we have Tilly Chang. She is the executive director at the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. She oversees the administration of the voter-approved half-cent transportation sales tax and other funding programs. She also leads the agency's county congestion management functions, including long-range planning for San Francisco's multimodal, multi-operator network. I'm also pleased that Alvaro Sanchez is with us today. He is the Vice President of Policy at the Greenlining Institute. There, he leads a team that develops policies to improve public health, catalyze economic opportunity, and enrich environmental quality for low-income communities and communities of color. So thank you so much, and I am very pleased to pass it over to Tim and Mike.
Great. Thank you very much, Laura, for that introduction. I want to especially thank Tilly and Alvaro for joining us as guest respondents. Really appreciate you making the time, and also, again, welcome to all of you joining the webinar. As those of you in Laura's introduction indicated, my main expertise in this project is really more on the vehicles and fuels side. So I did some work with those task teams, but then I also had the role of being kind of a ringleader on this VMT task team, which is something I've sort of casually been interested in for many years. But I want to highlight the other team members in addition to Professor Hyland, Professor Susan Handy, Professor Susan Shaheen, Professor Jean-Daniel Seforis, and Elliot Martin. These are really the subject matter experts for this task. So I want to thank them for all their hard work, and they get most of the credit for what we'll be presenting today, and they'll also be the ones that will probably direct most of your questions too. Susan Handy couldn't join us today, so if there's questions for her, we'll follow up with those questioners. So here's kind of a quick agenda for this very kind of high-level overview of this task. You can see the topics. We'll run through these pretty quickly. We have about 25 minutes for this presentation. We'll hear from the guest respondents, and then we'll have time for Q&A where we can maybe harken back to a few of these slides if people want to drill down a little bit more. So it's probably not too critical to this audience to say why VMT is a critical question to address, because a lot of you are very steeped in this. But clearly, anything we can do to reduce VMT effectively helps to reduce other travel and miles that we then ultimately want to electrify or switch out with clean fuels. So it kind of makes the problem smaller in a sense. I liken it to doing energy efficiency on a building before you size the solar panels and the battery and all of that. If you can kind of right size the system, then it makes the rest of it easier. Of course, VMT is notoriously hard to restrain, but that's what the question we tackle here. And we know that the state population is going to increase over the time period of the study over the next 25 years. So we're essentially trying to restrain VMT and reduce it some on a per capita basis. This recent ARB report that we have highlighted here highlights the role of some of these policies we'll talk about in restraining VMT and helping to meet ARB scoping plan goals. So what we've done in this case, and this really ties into the scenario analysis, is we've targeted a 15% per capita VMT reduction from our 2019 baseline to 2045. That 15% level is obviously somewhat arbitrary, but it's based on literature surveys and expert judgment about what we think we could possibly achieve through this suite of policies that we'll talk about. It's not one policy, it's a whole group of policies that would be needed to achieve even a 15% reduction in VMT on a per capita basis. So just to kind of preview the results, which we'll go through later with Mike in a little more detail. We looked at a built environment strategy that involves land use changes and changes in urban form, densification and public transit investments. And then we looked at 3 pricing strategies. We looked at 2 kind of TDM, transportation demand management, that is, strategies, and then 2 other strategies around micromobility and pooling. And in aggregate, we believe that those could achieve a 15% reduction with a few caveats that we'll indicate later. But as you can see, the pricing strategies, the group of pricing strategies appears to have the largest sort of single impact of those different buckets, followed by the built environment strategies, the TDM strategies, and the micromobility pooling strategies. So it's important to highlight kind of at the beginning here that VMT involves a complex interplay of different drivers and factors. So these involve socioeconomic conditions, land use changes, transportation system changes, roads and transit systems, and so forth. All of those impact travel demand, trip generation, trip distribution, a selection of modes. And then depending on how all that shakes out, that translates into vehicle miles of travel. But you can see with all these arrows, there's a lot of feedbacks and interaction between these things, making VMT a very complex topic, combination of behavioral and sort of physical infrastructure factors. Interesting. We get a little trouble advanced aside. With regard to the current state of VMT in California, you can see on the left kind of an interesting graph that charts the growth in VMT per capita, which is the blue line, and the growth of GDP per capita, which is the green line. And you can see those tracked pretty well up until about 10 to 12 years ago, where we saw GDP continue to rise coming out of the Great Recession. But VMT per capita has been relatively flat after kind of a dip there. I think very recent data Elliott Martin has would show a slight increase in per capita VMT in recent years prior to COVID. But then there's a COVID impact we'll talk briefly about in a minute. On the right, from the National Highway Travel Survey, the blue is the national sample showing mode splits by personal miles traveled. And then the right, the green, is the California sample. And you'll see that they're really fairly similar. We have a little bit more car travel in California relative to the national average, a bit less SUVs, a bit less vans, so and pickup trucks about the same. So overall, light duty mode splits are very similar for California and the national average, with some just very subtle differences. With regard to our business as usual scenario, which is the baseline that we used in the study, in the business as usual scenario, we assume basically in line with ARB projections that total VMT increases roughly in proportion, or pretty much closely in proportion, to population growth. So population grows by about 10 to 11%, which is what's forecast. We see total VMT increasing by a similar amount, dominated by light duty vehicle travel in the red line, with also some slow increases in heavy duty vehicle VMT. So that's the business as usual kind of baseline that we're comparing our low carbon scenario to. This is just a quick graph that Susan Handy came up with. This is from our friends over at Streetlight. And it just shows, this is from a year ago at the end, so this isn't very recent data, but this just shows the impact from Streetlight data of total VMT in California from the beginning of 2020 to late summer 2020. So you see the big dip from the sort of lockdown during the COVID around March of 2020, and then kind of a not super fast, but kind of a steady rebound in VMT, even as of late summer last year. So I haven't seen the very latest data, but clearly, vehicle miles traveled rebounded pretty quickly, but at the expense of transit and shared use modes that have not recovered yet. But I find this kind of striking that personal VMT rebounded this quickly, even as of this time last summer. So word on the policy background for this study. The two really important current policies are SB 375, the Sustainable Community Strategies. Many of you are very familiar with that. That actually targeted a goal of 19% per capita reductions by 2035. So a little more aggressive than what we've assumed in this study, although our study is statewide, and I'm not sure if the SB 375 includes the entire state. My other panelists will probably have a clearer read on that, Susan Shaheen in particular. And then a newer law, SB 743 on environmental quality, marked an important shift from measuring project impacts from level of service indicators to VMT more directly. And this has been, I think, somewhat controversial, but from the perspective of those really wanting to tackle VMT, it seems like a positive move to now focus more squarely on VMT versus level of service as a measure of environmental impact. It certainly correlates more closely with greenhouse gas emissions. Other proposed programs and current programs are regional programs for transit-oriented development and densification, more of that expected in the future. And then there have been proposals, and Mike Hyland's been studying this, to shift from gasoline taxes to pay for the roads to a VMT-based tax. Maybe sometime in the next handful of years to 10 or 15 years, we'll see that transition. As we electrify the vehicle fleet, of course, the gasoline sales tax becomes a less effective way of covering our transportation improvements. We'll need something else, whether it's a flat tax on EV owners or something more VMT-based. And then there's other strategies like cordon pricing that have been proposed for places like San Francisco and central Los Angeles, similar to some European cities. time check. So the low carbon scenario, what we call the LC1 scenario, this is covered by the scenario team in an early webinar that I think has been recorded. So it reaches near zero emissions by 2045 for the sectors that we included. It does include this 15% per capita reduction in VMT by 2045. So overall, state VMT declines slightly with 11% estimated population growth by 2045. And our team then examined a combination of VMT reduction strategies to achieve that target. So the analysis approach that we used leveraged, again, a short timeline for this study. We had to use as much existing work as we could and then build on it. Particularly work by Deborah Salon, who's a UC Berkeley grad, and UC Davis grad, and Bruce Appleyard, who's a UC Berkeley grad, have done excellent work in this area. You can see their current affiliations. And the basic approach is to develop an impacts assessment dashboard, kind of an Excel tool. We used, as we'll explain in a minute, definitions of 7 California place types and trying to understand VMT in that context. Work by Elliott Martin, adjust the census tract level populations to a 2018 base year we used for this part of the study. And then we looked at changes in the importance of place types over time as we expect land use to change and development to occur. We'll show that in a minute. And then we went and looked at the strategy and policy level impacts of VMT by place type and calculated those impacts in 5-year intervals. So these are the strategies that we looked at. For the built environment, it's TODS and densification, active transportation, public transit. The pricing strategies, we looked at taxes, VMT-based road fees we mentioned, possibility of cordon zones in dense urban areas where people would get charged to travel there. We looked briefly at other pricing schemes like hot lanes for congested corridors. For this study, we decided that those were too local and too variable. And there's also very mixed literature on whether hot lanes even do anything to reduce VMT. So we left that out of this study. But we did look at parking pricing as another pricing strategy. And then on the TDM front, work led by Susan Shaheen and Elliott Martin, we looked at telework and the potential persistence of telework, something that's obviously highly uncertain at this point in the wake of the COVID situation. And then also carpooling, similarly, something we hope rebounds fairly quickly. And then also Susan Shaheen's work looking at shared micromobility and pooling incentives for TNC operators. Those are transportation network companies. So these are the 7 place types that were developed by Deborah Salon, I think working with Susan Handy. She was doing her PhD work at UC Davis. And so you can see what those are: central areas, urban areas, suburban areas, and then more rural areas. So this was kind of a framework that we used not just for the built environment part of the study and land use, but also thinking about how these other policies would impact different place types. And we then associated all of the different census tracts in California to these place types and did the analysis on that basis. So to present more of our results, I'm going to hand this off to Mike Hyland, but I'll continue to advance the slides. So take it away, Mike.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I'll get into some of the numbers and the technical details. So here is the analysis approach for analyzing VMT reductions by strategy, place type, and time frame. So we composed this giant table right here. I have a shorter version of it with just a few strategies, just a couple place types in just 2 years to be exemplary. So this table was used for the pricing, demand management, and shared mobility strategies, and we'll cover in the next slide how we handled the built environment. So for these 3 sets of strategies, we're talking about direct impacts. So I chose the 3 strategies that I was involved in. So that's gasoline taxes, VMT-based road usage fees, and TNC pooling incentives. The gasoline tax was pretty specific in terms of how we formulated the policy. A 40-cent increase in the gasoline tax over existing gasoline tax levels coming in the year 2030. So you see that has a pretty substantial impact on VMT in urban high transit areas, not shown here. Also the suburban multifamily homes in center cities at about 1.8% reduction, but the impact in rural areas is minimal at best. And then you can also see as we move into the future, the impact begins to decrease or degrade. basically stemming from the fact that the vehicle fleet is going to be transitioning from gasoline vehicles to electric vehicles. So as the number of gasoline-powered vehicles decreases, so will the impact of a gasoline tax. Now you can contrast that with a VMT-based road usage fee, which we're suggesting will be implemented in 2040 as the gasoline tax begins to decrease in effectiveness for both reducing VMT and raising taxes or revenue for the transportation system. So with a 15 cent per mile fee on VMT, we have a reduction of 5% VMT in urban high transit areas with around a 1% reduction for rural areas. And then for TNC pool incentives, which is the idea that either the state or municipalities or really any level of government can incentivize transportation network companies, either using sticks or carrots, to get them to have more shared ride services as opposed to a pure ride hailing or ride sourcing service, which is going to be not very impactful in rural areas because of the lack of density, but could have significant impacts in higher density areas. You also see an increase in the impact from 2035 to 2045. That's stemming from the fact that the market share of TNCs in our study was expected to increase. And implicit in that is the potential for automated vehicles to be a substantial component of these fleets by the end of the 2030s and the beginning of the 2040s. Next slide, Tim. So I said on the previous slide, we analyzed the direct impacts of the pricing, travel demand management, and shared mobility strategies. But for the built environment and land use, we really looked at an indirect impact. We had all the census tracts in California. We used Professor Salon's strategy for categorizing those. We had existing trends for each one of these census tracts and whether they be categorized in the future, where the growth is, where the degrowth is. And basically we found there's effectively two ways to reduce VMT per capita through this structuring or categorizing of the census tracts. The first is to increase the population in areas, the central city, the urban high transit areas that currently have low VMT per capita. And the second strategy is to increase population and density, as well as transportation transit investments in the areas that currently have high VMT in order to push them into the low VMT category. So you can see here we have two big changes. We have an increase in suburban multifamily housing, which have a significantly lower VMT than the suburban single-family housing census tracts. And then we also have a decrease in the urban low transit census tracts. In terms of their importance, this is the people that live there and how many miles are being driven in those areas. So just to be clear, though, we're kind of fighting against existing trends, which is a higher proportion moving to suburban areas and a lower proportion of people or a lower proportion of growth in high density areas. Next slide, Tim. So here are those details, that summary results that Tim put up in the beginning. We have this split among the four categories, with pricing being the most impactful. See the rightmost column in this chart here, we have the total reduction in VMT from each one of the specific pricing policies, TDM policies, and shared mobility strategies in built environment. You can see that the VMT is really impactful, 3 to 5% reduction depending on how much you're going to charge VMT. And then the collection of built environment strategies is also pretty impactful, with a 4.7% reduction in VMT per capita. Next slide, Tim. So I'm just going to harp on one more takeaway from the study, is that there's really no one single policy or strategy that can realistically address this statewide problem, actually worldwide problem, and get us that 15%, but really a suite of policies are needed. So as you'll see on the next slide, we looked at every pair of possible strategies and seeing whether or not they're synergistic. What we found is that the pricing policies and the active transportation investments, the transit infrastructure investments, and micromobility all have positive synergistic effects with all the other policies and strategies. Particularly fruitful pairs are pricing policies and transit investments. That is, you make it more expensive to drive, but you provide good quality transit service alongside that increase in transportation costs or driving costs. Additionally, densification, infill development, transit-oriented development alongside either active transportation infrastructure or shared micromobility is particularly beneficial. Next slide, Tim. Yeah, and this is the details of exactly how the relationship between each one of the sets of policies. So you see, we do have a couple that possibly have kind of effects that negate each other. So some of those being telework, right? If you have an increase in telework, you have the potential for people to not trip chain their trips, which could be kind of have a negative impact, possibly on things like active transportation and transit usage. All right, Tim, I think that's it on my end.
Thanks, Mike. Very well done. Appreciate it. So yeah, kind of wrapping up now. We have just a couple minutes left before we move into our discussants. So the overall project findings, just to highlight this, as Mike pointed out, these VMT strategies will have different impacts by place type as the kind of lens that we applied here. And there's other ones you could think about, but it's how we structured this study. And also over time, where some policies kick in very early and then just kind of have a lasting impact. Other strategies we don't think are feasible, maybe in the very near term, like VMT taxes, but they would kick in later and then have an impact starting at that point. So they're different in both time and place, which makes it complicated to study. And I think, as we'll highlight on the next slide, fertile areas for future work. We've already said this, the pricing strategies and land use seem to have the largest proportional impact of the categories we studied, and that's partly a function of just how we put them into those categories. But as we've constructed it, those two strategies together have about 2/3 of the overall impact. And then transportation demand management strategy is also very significant. And then a smaller impact from things like micromobility, carpooling, active transport. There are two, in the context of the scenarios, the LC1 scenario, there are kind of two impacts here. First of all, any reduction in VMT directly impacts fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions. That's clear. It's also the case that in the scenario planning part of the study, we did assume that if the vehicles are going to be driven less, 15% less per capita and somewhat less, well, about 11% less than in the business as usual scenario, there would be some small, at least some level of downsizing of the vehicle fleet itself. So we assume a split there where vehicles are driven less per vehicle, but there are also somewhat fewer vehicles needed in the study. Now, that could be debated, but that's what the scenario team came up with. So that helps with, it doesn't affect the VMT team, our work at all, but it does affect the scenario in that if we have fewer vehicles, that means less vehicles we need to electrify, less electric infrastructure, and therefore somewhat lower costs in the LC1 scenario. Last slide, as we have just about a minute left, is future research directions that we see here. Are impacts of automation on VMT, and this is a very active area of research, and there's a lot of kind of conflicting literature about it, that automation could cut different ways depending on how it's implemented, and especially how much sharing there is, including the ride-hail fleet, very active area of research. Impacts of shared ride policies ties in with that for both carpooling, private carpools, and transportation network companies, especially in a post-COVID world where hopefully we do go back to sharing rides and carpooling. A big area is impacts on rural areas, especially regarding affordable housing and road pricing policies, the ones that Mike highlighted. I think there's a lot of work to do there to make sure those aren't regressive, or there's ways to mitigate them if they are. And tied in with that are further studies of the equity and environmental justice impacts of all this, and potential mitigation measures for lower income folks to make sure they're not disadvantaged. And then there's a couple other things that are important. Many years people have been trying to understand driver motivations, taking trips, what would encourage them to reduce their VMT and restrain that on a per capita basis. But I think we're clearly still trying to understand that and what would motivate them to drive less. And then one thing we did not study at all, because we felt like it was out of scope for this project, is the impact of road and capacity expansions in the future, including the high occupancy toll lanes that are being rolled out in various places, and what the ultimate impacts on VMT of those might be is not something we included in this study, but a ripe area for future work. So, Laura, we are at exactly our time.
Great.
I am going to stop sharing and hand it back over to you. Again, thanks everyone for attending this webinar. Thanks to Laura for organizing it, and Bernie, and to all my team members on this project. Thanks for all your great work.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim and Mike. A lot in there, a lot more in the report too. So there was a link dropped in the chat box to access the report. I know some folks joined late, so we'll add that in there again so you can read the full report, or at least the chapter on the VMT if that's what you're interested in. So I'm really excited to turn it over to, or hear from, our guest respondents, Tilly Chang and Alvaro Sanchez. So yeah, you can unmute yourself and show your screen. So first, let's hear from you, Tilly, and then Alvaro, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Laura, and kudos to Tim and Mike, Professor Lippman and Hyland, as well as your colleagues on this work. I read the VMT chapter of the report. I do refer folks to it. It's very readable. And given the ground you guys covered, which was really extensive, I really appreciated how easy it was to understand and really take in these findings, which are right sort of on target with what we've been sort of finding, as well as studying ourselves as part of our Plan Bay Area work here in San Francisco Bay Area for some time now, as well as at our agency, my agency, the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. You know, all of these challenges are huge. We know that the solution will ultimately be a combination of VMT and technology, but that technology alone is not going to help us reach our goals and solve these problems. We understand that it's a historic time, actually, in terms of transportation policy and investment, not only nationally, of course, but also in the state of California. Really appreciate the timing of this work and this webinar, given the IPCC report that came out a few weeks ago, the CAPTI initiative that's happening with the governor and CalSTA, Secretary Kim's office, and hopefully the new funding that's on the horizon, to help jurisdictions, large and small, to understand what tools are in the toolkit and the effectiveness, relative effectiveness of each of them, as well as in combination with each other. As a transit first city, proud transit first city, some of these findings really resonate with me. I really learned a lot as well about the combination effects of some of the findings. One of the things I'll just note is that during a crisis, San Francisco, like other cities, did experiment extensively. So we put in bike lanes, we put in transit-only lanes. Obviously, we transformed some streets for businesses and other uses to prioritize essential workers, as well as wellness, in the use of our public streets and spaces. And that's so, so important. So in addition to the climate benefits, the wellness and the social benefits cannot be understated. Of course, we're always trying to solve for multiple things in our city, but really these strategies that you highlighted, particularly the built environment and the are sort of the sweet spot of our strategy. Pricing is still very new, and it's going to take a lot of thoughtful and inclusive work. I know that Alvaro will probably address some of that as well, but I just want to acknowledge that here, at least in San Francisco, we're looking at strategies around the built environment together with pricing, but in a comprehensive way that includes a lot of on-the-ground planning. And that context is really important because, whether you're talking about bringing, in potential new technologies and the role of new mobility, whether you're talking about different parking pricing, for example, that we've done for many years, but into the road pricing arena, that's going to take a very thoughtful and inclusive process to understand how to make things fair and equitable. So I'm sorry, is my connection getting shaky? I apologize if it is. I'll just also note the telecommute trend there is going to be really, and I wonder if you guys looked at or considered, is the marginal cost of folks making sense to take to purchase transit passes. If you're just going in a few days a week, and previously it made sense, but now you're just going in a few days, that marginal sort of decision to invest in to pay for parking really becomes a potential real challenge, for transit and for commuters and employers as well. Also, the Clean Miles work that was highlighted in the report. I'll just again give a note out there that the TNC and AV sector, of course, passenger services for AV is very exciting. And yet we want to make sure that from the get-go, we learn from the TNC sort of rollout experience, and we try to ensure this rollout is as sustainable as possible. And finally, on incentives, I do think that one of the things that was interesting there that I saw was the TNC incentives. I'll just note that our sister agency in San Mateo actually did a great pilot looking at incentives for carpoolers, so all commuters, not just TNC commuters. And that was somewhat effective pre-COVID. So for all of these sort of reasons, I really thought there was so much to digest. I'm trying to what you guys found, but really appreciate of what appears to be effective. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tilly. So Alvaro, we're very interested in hearing your reaction. And just a quick reminder too, if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A. And I'll even tell our speakers and Tilly, as Alvaro shares comments, to maybe even going in there and looking at those questions and typing some responses. So Alvaro?
Yes, thank you for the invitation to join, and thank you for all this great work. Very interesting stuff to take a look at, and very much I agree with Tilly. This is the time to be talking about all these issues, not only because of obviously the climate change impacts that we're experiencing and that we know we'll continue to experience for quite some time, but also because I think we're in a moment where, due to the pandemic and due to everything that we've gone through, it's kind of opened up this window of opportunity to think about we need to do something very different. Because I think we noticed just through the pandemic how susceptible our transportation infrastructure actually is to a public health crisis in this case. But moving forward, we're going to unfortunately have to contend with different kinds of crises, that are going to be arising because of climate change. And I think from my perspective as a person that's working on racial equity issues and thinking about vulnerable populations in California, when I think about this conversation about how do we reduce vehicle miles traveled, I can't help but think, how does it impact them? And I think that that's one of the things that I noticed that, an area of future study is going to be about the equity considerations about these different strategies, because they all have different impacts. And we really need to understand what those are. Because if there's one thing that we know from the transportation sector already, is that the availability of transit and your access to mobility is actually one of the biggest predictors about your access to upward mobility, economic upward mobility. And for so many people, that's not something that they benefit from and they enjoy. So I think as we go through the exercise of figuring out how to reduce vehicle miles traveled, we have to think and keep in mind, how do we increase access to effective mobility for those people that need it the most, in order to not have a kind of double negative impact on those folks that would be susceptible to these kinds of reduction strategies that would further exacerbate their inability to be able to connect to work, employment, health, et cetera. So one key consideration, I think. Another thing that we know from the transportation sector is that unfortunately, our planning processes, our decision-making processes, our funding processes have burdened and locked in poverty and pollution into our most impacted communities. And most of these are Black and Brown communities throughout the country. So as we do this study around what do we need to do now moving forward to develop the kinds of transportation network that is attuned to reducing vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas reduction, that we don't replicate that same process of burdening those communities and making sure that they have a seat at the table and that we accurately consider their approaches. So a couple of things that stood out to me is really thinking about the negative externalities of these different proposals. So switching from a gas tax to a vehicle mile travel fee, I think we have to think about, well, who is kind of burdened with driving more these days, right? And I think older, folks that use older vehicles currently with a gas tax, they have to pay more. They have less efficient vehicles, so they're having to pay more into a gas tax that everybody, technically benefits from. So that's somewhat of a regressive tax. If we move forward to a vehicle, a miles pricing strategy, we have to, I think, consider who's been pushed out to the margins and has to continue to travel back into the urban cores for employment, because that would be putting a pressure point on them. And I think we have to really closely consider that. And what do we do with the fact that we've developed land use patterns that are getting people further and further out in order for an affordability issue, but now have to travel back into urban cores to be able to gain employment. And if we put a price on how far away they're driving or how far they're driving, I think we have to closely look at that. Another thing that we have to think about is not just the vehicle miles travel benefit of our strategies, but do those strategies have other externalities that we have to study as well? I saw the TNCs being one of the strategies to consider. And yes, as a vehicle miles travel strategy, it does seem appropriate. But as we all know, the TNC companies have other social externalities, such as not being the best employers, not having the best track record, a lot of burden being placed on the drivers versus that being absorbed by the companies. And because the companies were able to advance challenge a state law around them being employers, I think we have to consider those as well, so that we're not just driving a strategy that on one end seems to benefit us through vehicle mile reduction, but on another end, it puts burdens on some of those populations that are already burdened in employment and benefits and what they're being asked to contribute as independent contractors. So another kind of key consideration there. And then I think COVID-19 just opened up this area of opportunity. So the last thing that I'll mention is that there were so many things that we didn't think possible. One of them was free transit service for priority populations, and it's something that we were really interested in pursuing. And I noticed that wasn't one of the strategies that was considered here in terms of just making transit free. What would that do to vehicle miles traveled if people didn't have to consider paying for their transit, and instead it was just subsidized? So I'll finish there, and thank you for the time and look forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alvaro. I had so many questions, but I want to honor those that are coming into the Q&A as well. And so we do have quite a few in there that are coming in. I see that there were some answered. So thank you for that, Tim and Mike. And Tilly and Alvaro, if you're also looking here, and if there's any ones that you would like to speak to as a part of this Q&A session, that will be great. So there's one here. Let's see at the. So one question is here on about what the proposed strategy to make clean vehicle alternatives more affordable, more convenient. That's a great question. I think for this panel, we're focused more on VMT. However, Tim, I know you do a lot of work in this area, and we also have a whole webinar that was on this as well, and I can drop a link into that. But Tim, did you want to comment on that at all, or?
Yeah, briefly. You're right. It's a little off topic, but there is quite a bit of effort there. There's the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program, obviously, is the major incentive program at the state level, which provides significant incentives for zero-emission vehicles, plug-in hybrids, fuel cell vehicles, and it has evolved in recent years to have a means test, which makes it more targeted at lower income folks. Initially in the program, there was no income test, so people buying $100,000 Teslas could qualify for the incentive. That's no longer true. I think any vehicle over 60,000 doesn't qualify anymore. And then if you make, I don't know the income threshold, single, married couple, whatever, what the numbers are, but if you make over a certain amount, you don't qualify anymore. So it is being more targeted to the people who need the incentive more. And then of course, we're seeing action now at the federal level to extend federal level tax credits for people purchasing these vehicles. So if you combine the state with the federal, if you do have tax liability, you can get the federal tax credit as well. And those together provide a very strong incentive to reduce cost of those vehicles. Of course, electric vehicles in particular are cheaper to operate. So once people get into them, they save money on gas. From a cost of ownership perspective and lower maintenance, it looks good. But and then the other thing is we're seeing significant cost declines in battery technology, electric vehicle technology. Over the last 10 years, it's been fairly striking how much battery technology has improved and how costs have fallen. So that should really all help over the next handful of years, especially 10 years, to make these vehicles much more affordable to a wider group of people.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I see the question too, to more diversity to choose from. So we hope those car manufacturers will start doing that if they're going to be able to sell these cars. So, and oh yeah, Tilly.
Laura, may I just add to the topic of EVs?
Yeah.
Our hope here is that electric bicycles will become even more accessible, so that we have, the lower price point, the ability to extend incentives again to households, that are need the affordability incentive and consideration there as far as subsidies. So we're hopeful that some bills that are making their way through the legislature may be successful. Here in San Francisco, with all our hills, e-bikes are a game changer, but they are still out of reach for a lot of families. So we want to make sure that EV car subsidies are not the only thing on the policy radar, but also EV bike subsidy programs perhaps as well.
Yeah, fantastic point. I just noticed there was 10 million included in the state budget to support e-bike incentives. So that's really exciting. We're also doing some research on that too. So we're really excited to see that. So another question is coming in here is, what is the proposed strategy for land use, TOD, transit enhancements for all these different groups, especially the millennials, Gen Z, retiring, so those that are transit dependent. And this question also reminds me of a comment you made, Alvaro, is how do we make sure that there's not a group that's left behind, right? As we're trying to reduce VMT, how are we also increasing mobility among those that need it, right? And so I was wondering if I can open this to the group too, so one, how do we address the VMT unique needs of these groups, and how is that considered as a part of the strategies or analysis that was considered? But then also, how do we make sure that as we reduce VMT, we're also making sure we're not reducing mobility of those that really need access to opportunities, et cetera?
Really good question. I wonder if Susan Shaheen might want to field this one. It's up her alley. Susan, do you have a take on this?
Yeah, I love this question. And what I wanted to share is in a lot of the work that I contributed to the collaborative study, we were working with existing literature and existing data points in terms of demand elasticities. And a lot of that is at the aggregate level, right? Less specific to particular populations, let alone generational differences. So what I'd say is that these are the kinds of questions we should really be examining in terms of life stage and social equity implications associated with those life stages, along with different income quartiles, et cetera, as part of future research. And that leads me to this exciting program that we're launching at UCITS that will be looking at decarbonization and having more research dollars available to dig deeper and peel back the onion in terms of specifically targeting and looking at VMT from various sociodemographic variables, but I think these generational differences.
Yeah, I will say, I'll add just briefly, we did, Jean-Daniel Sephores looked a little bit at a strategy that would be subsidizing transit passes for students and low income. We did, look at that, but didn't include it as a formal strategy because it was a small group of people we were sort of looking at. We didn't think would have a big statewide effect. But that is something that could be done. And Tilly, I liked your point about, people before who were buying transit passes and commuting 5 days a week, the transit pass made sense for them. Now, if they're going in 2 days a week, how can we continue to encourage them to use transit by pricing it appropriately? And to Alvaro's point, for certain groups, maybe we could make it free and subsidize it. I know that that's being talked about at the federal level as well. How exactly to implement that is a little tricky probably, but I like those lines of thinking and just this idea of how do people's travel patterns change as they move through life. There's the sense the millennials or young people, they sort of eschew cars, but then when they go out and have kids, need to get them to school, what do they do then? Do they just kind of follow patterns of the previous generations or not? It'd be very interesting to see how that plays out.
I know so much of that answer is going to depend on if we're able to build housing for them, and that's really at the root. And I think we all appreciate that. It's the root of a lot of our VMT troubles. We have sprawled as a region, despite, all the good intentions, all the transit investment of our region here in the Bay Area. We have sprawled tremendously, right, over the years, decades. And we know that that's at the heart of it. So number one, it's land use and housing and affordable housing, as well as the location of that, transit accessible, TOD, parking, trained and priced appropriately. So,
yeah, I'll follow it up just by agreeing and saying that that's. I hope one of the things we were able to get out in the report was that these policies are synergistic in many ways in terms of reducing VMT, but also in terms of addressing, I think, a lot of the issues that Alvaro brought up about people who now are forced to move farther away from jobs and healthcare services, et cetera. So if you are getting that infill development, you are building the TOD, those folks can move a little bit closer and not have to pay, way too much money for housing close to those opportunities. I mean, just one other thing I wanted to point out. I realize it's probably a common sense thing that low-income people are probably less elastic in terms of the gas tax increases, in the sense that they're already minimizing how much they're driving right now. And if you increase the gas taxes, they're just going to be able to maybe cut out a few miles. There's a ton of academic literature mentioned in the report that calls that out, which is that when you do increase gas taxes, it's the wealthier people that decrease their usage of vehicles. Low-income people are still getting to jobs, still getting their kids to school, still going to healthcare activities. It's just costing them more than it did before.
All right. So thank you all for those thoughtful responses. I see some other questions in here, but I do want to get back to this point that all of you brought up to some point or at some aspect in your comments, is about as we reduce VMT, how do we make sure that we are also allowing for mobility, especially for those that need to access their job and services. And Alvaro, I might start with you, because that was a comment you really underscored as a part of your comments. And so curious, have you been thinking more about it? What are your suggestions there? What is your advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think my advice is that we have to look at what prevents people's mobility. And sometimes that is not the access to a vehicle, for example, it's actually their income. So I think we really have to think about the associated, and I mean, I saw the VMT diagram, and I do appreciate that because, all the factors that go into it. But I think sometimes it's just like really thinking outside the box. And this is where sometimes I get frustrated with the rigidity sometimes of our sectors, where if it's something that's it's a little bit outside of the box and it doesn't quite fit in, we don't think of it as a VMT strategy. So for example, universal basic income right now is something that a lot of people are thinking about. The state of California actually invested a lot of resources this budget year into piloting more universal basic income programs in the state. But could that be considered a VMT strategy? Because if more people have more available resources to be able to actually pay for the transit that they need to get from point A to point B, could we think of that as being one of the components for VMT strategies? And I think there's a lot of literature out there that says that if folks had more available income and our income and wealth gap was actually breached, it would actually serve us really well for our climate strategies. But we often never think about that in terms of our climate mitigation work. So I think that would be my main thing. It's like, I think we're at a point where we really have to be innovative and be thinking about, kind of these parallel processes that we sometimes don't consider core to our environmental work, but they are, because those are the barriers that are getting in front of people not being able to actually contribute to the reduction of vehicle miles traveled.
And Tilly, if I could call on you too, as a part of your comments, you're one of the agencies that are looking at pricing, and you underscored you'd be thoughtful about it and inclusive about it to make sure that a pricing strategy didn't have those unintended impacts on underserved or underserved communities, low-income communities. So how are you thinking about this as a part of the work you're doing?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. So we've got two pricing initiatives. Folks may or may not be aware of our Treasure Island work in addition to our downtown congestion pricing study. And they're similar. The idea there is to reduce congestion and to expand the number of mobility options that folks have in an equitable way, really to advance equity. In the case of our Treasure Island program, it's actually connected to an island development, 8,000 units of housing. And there's a congestion toll that's authorized in addition to a developer subsidy. Another form of pricing in that project is that all market rate units are required to purchase a monthly transit pass. So that's a guarantee form of transit-based revenue that we can then use to subsidize a clean ferry to go back and forth from the island to downtown San Francisco and East Bay Transit and the like. One of the things we'll also do is to reward folks for taking transit most days. And that's another strategy that we can consider, not just in that context or downtown Corydon or even on express lane. So for most commuters who are by and large taking transit most days, maybe we can reward them by letting them bank a toll credit or a fare credit for that 11th day that they may need to drive. And that in that way, we're really treating and rewarding them for doing the sustainable thing most days. But as everyone needs occasionally to drive, we're not trying to punish you. In fact, we may be able to help you bank some toll credits if the program is structured correct in that way.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I know we're doing a lot of research on pricing too, especially looking at the equity impact. So I hope we can drop a link to our website. So I encourage others that are interested in this topic to go see some of this research because it's being done right now. And we're very interested in this topic as well.
Sorry, Laura, I should have just mentioned, and of course, I should have mentioned that we will also have affordability discounts, so income-based discounts. And we heard that loud and clear from all of our stakeholders, residents, merchants, everyone. And that's a feature that is currently sort of structured within the toll strategy and the toll pricing framework, the discount and exemption policy for lowest income exempt, low income 2/3 discount, and then moderate income in addition would also be proposed to have a discount as well. So those are really important, the means-based programs and structure.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I can see we're getting the responses to our questions. Alvaro is typing one right now that I see. So all of our speakers too, if you want to even go to that answer tab, you can provide some more answers. I know we're getting to the end, but I might want to close with a quick lightning round for comments on this telecommuting question. That was something that came in. How is telecommuting going to play into everything? And I know we don't have a crystal ball to see how this COVID telecommuting will really play out, but interested to hear commentary from our speakers and guest respondents on that. And again, this will be our lightning round because we are close to the top of the hour.
I'll cede my time to Susan. I know she addressed this for us in the report.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, this was a juicy question. And one in which, Laura, we didn't have access to real-time data, right, on work from home policies, how they were evolving, how they were changing. This new normal or next normal that we've entered into is quite different than telework of the past that was less flexible or not required, for example, by a public health crisis. So that is an area that I think is a bit of a wild card for us and requires a lot of deep research. We had a lot of really great conversations around this in our study team, but we're largely restricted to using existing resources. So I think I'd chalk this one up to very important future research and one in which we're probably going to have to create more scenarios because this is not going to be evenly distributed across the state in terms of this policy or evenly distributed in terms of employer preferences and employee preferences.
And I think I'd like to hear from Alvaro and Tilly, but it raises the specter of even more inequality, I think, because a lot of the people who can work from home have jobs that tend to be more, affluent type jobs, white collar jobs. A lot of lower income folks have jobs they have to show up at work. So they won't be able to benefit from some of these, the savings and the time savings of telework. So it heightens potential disparities, I think, but curious to hear what the others say.
All right, closing thoughts from Tilly and Alvaro.
Yeah. We'll just say that traffic is already up to pre-COVID, and the Bay Area bridges are a bit different because they reflect different industrial land use patterns. Silicon Valley bridges, sort of lag the Bay Bridge and Northern bridges. But we want to make sure that folks have that transit option. And all three operators the major operators have discounted fares in the month of August. Muni is free for youth in San Francisco. We're so grateful to Mayor Bart and Caltrain have 50% fare discounts in September. So really the affordability point that Alvaro made cannot be under stressed. It's really, really important for us to remove all barriers and make sure that riders have the confidence to take transit, as well as the means for those who have difficulty affording it.
Definitely. And Alvaro.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, and this is speaking from Greenlining as an employer, I think we're going to be moving towards a hybrid model. So it's not going to be full telecommuting or full in office. I think we're moving forward with, we're just going to have a lot more work from home days that people can benefit from. So I think that that's one scenario to think about and explore. What does that mean for, all of this conversation?
Yeah, so more to come on that. All right. Well, we are at 2 p.m. A special thanks to our speakers. Thank you so much, Tim and Mike. Thank you for joining us. Susan and Elliot, also on the research team. Thank you, Alvaro and Tilly. Greatly appreciate your comments. You add such value to these conversations. Before you go, I did put a link in an evaluation survey. Tell us what you thought of the webinar, how we could be better. We really are thankful for everyone who takes the time to fill out our survey. And we hope you join us next week. We're going to be talking about medium and heavy duty trucks. And so we have a link in there to register and hope to see you then. All right, everyone. Thank you again for joining us and have a lovely rest of the day. Take care.